One of the most important voices for liberty in the struggle for independence were the clergymen, in particular the clergymen of New England. They preached liberty.
Pastors were actively involved at the original part of leading to the Declaration of Independence and to the Revolutionary War, because it was pastors who were choosing to lead many of their congregations out onto the battlefield.
One of the earliest voices for independence was Rev Jonathan Mayhew of West Church, Boston. He died in 1766, long before the conflict really heated up. After the Unjust Stamp Act went into effect in 1765, Reverend Mayhew denounced the king from the pulpit. His text was Romans chapter 13, written by the Apostle Paul.
Common tyrants and public oppressors are not entitled to obedience from their subjects by virtue of anything here laid down by the inspired apostle. The king is as much bound by his oath not to infringe the legal rights of the people as the people are bound to yield subjection to him, from whence it follows that as soon as the prince sets himself above the law, he loses the king in the tyrant. He does, to all intents and purposes, unking himself. Jonathan Mayhew.
This is reminiscent of a phrase from the Huguenots, that is, French Calvinists, from a century before. Resistance to tyrants is obedience to God. This was a phrase Thomas Jefferson liked to use. Preaching on political subjects was nothing new to the ministers of New England. Elections were usually annual events, and before the ballots were cast, a minister would preach an election day sermon.
There is probably no group of men in history living in a particular area at a given time who can speak as forcibly on the subject of liberty as the Congregational ministers of New England between 1750 and 1785. Franklin P. Cole.
The clergymen were disdained for the most part by the Crown appointees. The Crown also halted town hall meetings, a tradition practiced in New England virtually from the very beginning. But opposition to British tyranny by the American clergy was not exclusively a New England phenomenon.
The Philadelphia ministers thunder and lighten every Sabbath against George III's despotism. John Adams.
In those days, the church was kind of the hub of the community.
The pulpit was generally not silent on issues related to government, since most of the colonies, at least in New England, had been started by ministers 150 years before. As conflict between Britain and the American colonists began to brew, Britain blamed many of the ministers for reportedly stirring up trouble. They even had a derisive moniker for these ministers, the Black-Robed Regiment, so named because of the color of their robes.
There never was an official regiment of black-robed preachers, but the Black-Robed Regiment is the name that the British gave for these, what we often call Patriot Pastors. These pastors that preached patriotism, they found it, they believed in Scripture, and so they were the ones recruiting the men to go and fight. And they would typically preach in black robes on Sunday mornings.
To the pulpit, the Puritan pulpit, we owe the moral force which won our independence. John Wingate Thornton.
During the War for American Independence, some of the ministers provided pivotal leadership. An example is the Reverend James Caldwell, a Presbyterian minister in Elizabethtown, New Jersey. His wife was shot by a British soldier through a window as she was reading one day.
So James Caldwell finds out about it, actually eulogizes her, and then he's off to Springfield, New Jersey, because they're engaging the British there, and the men that he's working with and helping to lead are in Springfield. When he gets there, they're in a mess because they've run out of wadding for their muskets. And of course, those old flintlock muskets that are like the ones here behind me, you had to have wadding to make those things usable on the battlefield, to hold the shot tight down in the barrel. So he rides over to the First Presbyterian Church of Springfield, gathers up hymn books that are filled with hymns written by Isaac Watts, a famous hymn writer of that day, goes back to his men, throws out the hymn books, telling them to tear the pages out and use the pages for wadding. So as they are shoving Isaac Watts hymns down the muzzles of their muskets, firing away at the British, James Caldwell, the Presbyterian preacher, is standing there yelling, "Give them Watts, boys, put Watts into them." And so it just kind of gives you an idea of the flair of these men and the great passion with which they stood for their liberties.
Not all the ministers, of course, agreed with participating in politics or in the war effort. An interesting contrast on this point comes with the two Muellenberg brothers reared in the Lutheran tradition.
John Peter Gabriel Muellenberg was a pastor out of Woodstock, Virginia. And in 1776, he preached a sermon from Ecclesiastes chapter 3. And what he said was, there's a time for peace, there's a time for war, now's the time to fight.
He takes off his clerical robe. Underneath, he's wearing the uniform of a Continental officer. He has an altar call, and 300 men of his church and some of the surrounding churches come forward, kiss their wives goodbye, and they ride off to become the 8th Virginia Regiment.
But Peter Muellenberg was not the only preacher in the Muellenberg family, even considering his father, because Peter had some brothers, and one of his brothers was named Frederick Muellenberg.
His brother, Frederick Augustus Muellenberg, he's pastoring in New York. He's writing letters to John Peter saying, "You are getting too involved in matters which, as a preacher, you have nothing whatsoever to do." John Peter writes back to Frederick, says, well, you're a Tory sympathizer. The Tories were the British. And Frederick writes back, says, well, I cannot serve two masters. And they're going at each other until the British invade New York and begin to bombard it and fires. And Frederick Augustus Muellenberg's church is burnt down, and his wife and kids have to flee the city. And he has a little change of heart. And he says, maybe we do need to get involved.
So he becomes a member of the Continental Congress. He becomes a member of the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. And Frederick Muellenberg, who said preachers shouldn't get involved, actually is the first Speaker of the House of the United States of America and is one of the signatories of the original Bill of Rights. So what a turnaround Frederick Muellenberg experienced.
It was many of the pastors who chose to lead their men of their congregations onto the battlefield, and from what research that I have studied, many of them would sometimes leave on their clerical robes to make sure that in the heat of battle they would know where their leader was. So the pastor literally was one of those leaders. John Adams in 1814 makes an interesting declaration. He says this, had it not been for pastors, the Revolutionary War would not have been won.
Men like Phineas, men like Elijah who slew 400 prophets of Baal.
Thus, some of the ministers during the time of independence, especially the Congregational and the Presbyterian ones, played a key role in stirring America on to liberty.